The morning they tried to have me declared incompetent, my own son wouldn't even look at me. He sat at the far table in a charcoal suit I'd paid for, turning a cufflink over and over like a man waiting on a dentist. Beside him, my daughter-in-law, Sabrina, gave me the small, patient smile you give a stranger's child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. I came into that courtroom in the brown corduroy jacket I'd worn to my wife's funeral, my glasses fogged from the January cold, and I let my hand tremble a little on the head of a cane I did not actually need. Their attorney, a slick young fellow named Pruitt, who smelled good coffee and better cologne, barely lifted his eyes from his legal pad. To every one of them, I was a formality. A signature to be collected, an old man who'd wandered in from the wrong decade. Then Judge Whitfield looked up from the file, and every drop of color drained out of his face. He set his pen down very slowly, the way you set down something you're afraid you might drop. His lips parted. "It can't be," he said, so quiet that the court reporter leaned in to catch it. The whole room went still. Trevor stopped fussing with his cufflink. Sabrina's smile flickered and died. Pruitt turned around, confused as if he'd heard a fire alarm no one else could hear. And Judge Whitfield just kept staring at me like a man looking at a photograph of somebody who'd been dead for 30 years. They had no idea who I was. Not really. Not one of them. My name is Raymond Ellison. I'm 68 years old. And if you'd met me at the feed store or in the pew behind you at Sunday service, you'd have taken me for exactly what I appeared to be. A quiet widower in a plaid shirt who kept mostly to himself. If this story pulls at something in you, do me a small kindness and hit that like button. It helps an old man feel a little less invisible. Subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one. And tell me down in the comments where in this country from and what the weather's doing there tonight. It means more than you know, sitting out here on my porch, to imagine all of you scattered across the map, listening. But let me take you back, because none of what happened in that courtroom makes sense until you understand how it began. It started on a gray Tuesday in October, at the mailbox at the end of my gravel drive. I've got a few acres in the hills outside a little town called Willow Creek in western Pennsylvania. A plain white farmhouse, a leaning red barn I keep meaning to fix, and a pond out back where I used to teach my grandson to cast a line. My wife, Nora, and I bought the place 40 years ago with money we didn't have and paid off nickel by nickel. She passed a year and a half ago. Ovarian cancer, quick and merciless. Since then, the house has been too big and too quiet, and I've filled the silence with chores and coffee and the radio. That Tuesday, among the seed catalogs in the church bulletin, there was a thick envelope from a mortgage company I'd never done business with. I almost tossed it as junk. Something made me open it, standing right there in the cold. It was a statement for a reverse mortgage on my house, taken out 4 months earlier, drawing down against the home Nora and I had bled for, with more than $190,000 already disbursed to an account I did not recognize. I read it 3 times. The wind picked up and rattled the dry corn in the field, and I stood there, feeling like the ground had tilted under my boots. I had never signed such a thing. I had never spoken to these people in my life, and yet there was my name, printed clean and official across the top of a document that was quietly eating the only thing I had left to leave behind. Now, most men my age might have panicked, might have called their kids in tears. I did call Trevor, but not before I sat down at my kitchen table, poured a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and made myself go very still and very cold inside. Because, you see, before I was the quiet old man with the pond and the leaning barn, I spent 31 years as a special agent with IRS criminal investigation, financial crimes, fraud, laundering, forged instruments, men in tailored suits who stole with a fountain pen instead of a gun. I'd read 10,000 documents just like the one shaking in my hand, and I knew the particular smell of a thing that had been engineered. But he was my boy, so I called him, and I let myself hope I was wrong. He answered on the 4th ring, over the noise of a restaurant. "Dad, hey, kind of in the middle of something. Everything okay?" "Trevor, I got a statement in the mail. There's a reverse mortgage on the house. Nearly $200,000 drawn down. I never signed anything. Somebody's using my name." There was a pause, just a beat too long. I've interviewed enough people across the table to know the exact weight of a pause like that. When he spoke again, his voice had softened into something careful and rehearsed. Okay, Dad. Don't get worked up. I'll look into it. It's probably a mix-up. You've been forgetting a lot of things lately, remember? Maybe you and I talked about this and it slipped your mind. I gripped the edge of the table. I have not forgotten taking out a mortgage, son, Dad. A sigh, the kind you give a difficult child. Sabrina and I will come up this weekend, all right? We'll sort it out. Just don't call the bank yourself, okay? You'll only confuse things. Let me handle it. Don't call the bank yourself. I turned that phrase over long after he'd hung up. A guilty man doesn't want the investigator to have direct access to the record. They drove up that Saturday in Sabrina's white SUV, the one with the leather seats that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. Trevor came in kissing the top of my head, calling me old man, with that easy affection he'd had since he was a boy, and for a moment I nearly let it all melt away. He's my son, my only child. Nora went into labor with him during a thunderstorm, and I drove 90 miles an hour on a flooded road to get her to the hospital, praying the whole way. You don't stop loving someone just because the arithmetic stops adding up. I put the reverse mortgage statement on the kitchen table between us. Explain this to me. Trevor didn't touch it. He leaned back in Nora's old chair and laced his fingers behind his head. Dad, here's the thing. Money's been tight. And you've not been yourself. The lake trip you don't remember, the doctor's appointment you missed twice. I've been helping you manage things. There was some paperwork we did together to get some equity out, to cover your care going forward. You signed it. You just don't remember. I don't remember, I repeated, because it never happened. That's when Sabrina leaned in, laying a manicured hand flat on the table. She's a handsome woman, my daughter-in-law, all sharp angles and good posture, and she has a way of speaking to you, like she's already grieving your decline. Ray, she said gently, we didn't want to bring this up, but last month, when we came by, you'd left the truck running in the garage. Door closed. The whole place was thick with exhaust. You could have died in your sleep. And 2 weeks ago, you called Trevor at 3 a.m. asking where Nora was. You didn't remember she'd passed. Her eyes glistened, right on cue. We love you. We're scared for you. This isn't easy for us either. I want you to understand what that did to me, sitting in my own kitchen. Because for one terrible second, I doubted myself. The garage. Nora. My hand went cold around the coffee mug. I thought, could I have? Am I? And then the investigator in me, the part that never fully retired, stepped in and did the math. I hadn't started that truck in 3 weeks. The battery had been dead since the first frost, and I'd been meaning to get a jump. I keep the keys on a hook by the door, and I could see them from where I sat, untouched. And I have never, not once, forgotten that my wife is gone. I feel her absence every single morning in the empty half of the bed. There is no fog thick enough to erase that. My daughter-in-law was looking me dead in the eye and inventing a memory to hang around my neck. Now, 31 years of doing what I did teaches you one iron rule. When you catch the con early, you do not let the con know you've caught it. The moment you show your hand, they escalate. They'll take your anger and your fear and hold it up as proof of your instability. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done at that table. I let my shoulders sag. I let my eyes go wet and lost. I looked down at my own trembling hands and I whispered, I don't know. Maybe you're right. Maybe I did. Sabrina's hand tightened over mine, warm and triumphant. Oh, Ray, it's okay. We're going to take care of everything. Trevor exhaled like a man who'd cleared a hurdle. That's all we want, Dad. For you to be safe. They stayed another hour. Sabrina made tea in my own kitchen, pressing a mug into my hands. Chamomile, she said, to help me rest, because I looked so tired. I thanked her. I held that warm mug and smiled and did not drink a single drop of it, and when she wasn't looking, I poured it down the sink behind me and rinsed the cup. Because here is a thing I've learned about people. They show you who they are, and then they hand you a cup of tea. That night, after their taillights disappeared down the gravel, I sat in the dark of the living room for a long time. My sadness had burned off, and what was left underneath was something hard and clear and quiet. They thought they were dealing with a grieving old man circling the drain. They thought grief had made me soft, and confusion had made me easy. They had forgotten, or more likely never really knew, what their father did for a living for 3 decades. They'd woken something that had been sleeping a long while. Over the next 2 weeks, the pieces kept coming, and none of them made me feel any better. The chamomile to help me rest turned into a little amber bottle Sabrina brought up the following weekend. Just a mild supplement, Ray. The doctor thought it might steady your nerves. I took the bottle, thanked her sweetly, and the moment they left, I sealed one of the capsules in a sandwich bag. There was a man I'd worked with years ago, retired now, who ran a small independent lab down in Pittsburgh. I mailed it to him with a note and $40 folded inside. 10 days later, he called me, and there was iron in his voice. Ray, he said, there's no vitamin in this. This is a benzodiazepine, ground into a gel cap. Somebody's dosing somebody. If it's you, you need to get to a safe place, and you need to get to it today. I thanked him and told him I was already handling it, but I sat down hard on the porch step after I hung up. Because knowing a thing in your gut and holding the proof of it in your hand are two different weights entirely. My daughter-in-law had been trying to fog my mind so a courtroom would believe I couldn't find it. They weren't just after the house. They were building a case, a paper trail of a confused, medicated old man who forgot to turn off his truck and forgot his own dead wife, so they could stand in front of a judge and ask to be handed the keys to my entire life. Guardianship, they call it. Conservatorship. In this state, a judge can appoint your children to control your money, your property, your medical care, your very freedom, if a doctor signs a piece of paper saying you can't manage on your own. And I learned they already had the doctor. I found that out because I did the one thing Trevor told me not to do. I called the mortgage company myself, from a cheap prepaid phone I bought with cash at a gas station 2 towns over, giving a name that wasn't mine. I talked to a very helpful young woman who, believing I was a title officer, walked me right through the file. The application had been submitted with a power of attorney, a document giving Trevor full authority over my affairs, notarized and dated back in the spring, supposedly signed by me in the presence of a notary named in the file. I had never met that notary. I had been 300 miles away at a cardiology appointment on the date it was signed. I had the parking receipt in my glove box to prove it. It was a forgery, start to finish, and attached to the guardianship petition they'd quietly filed in county court was a capacity evaluation signed by a geriatric specialist named Dr. Halloran, declaring me suffering from moderate to severe cognitive decline, unfit to manage his affairs. I had never once been examined by Dr. Halloran in my life. That's when I stopped being sad and got to work. I had one phone call left in me that mattered, and I made it from the porch on a cold, clear night with the whole Milky Way spilled out over the barn. I dialed a number I'd carried in my head for 20 years. Frank Delgado answered on the second ring, that gravel voice unchanged by time. Frank and I had spent a decade on opposite sides of the aisle. I built the cases. He defended the men I built them against, and somewhere in all those years of trading blows, we'd become the closest thing either of us had to a brother. He's one of the sharpest elder law and white-collar attorneys on the East Coast now, and he does not scare. Frank, I said, it's Ray Ellison. I'm calling from a burner. Don't call my regular line back. There was a silence, and then a low laugh with no humor in it. Ray Ellison doesn't buy burner phones to shoot the breeze. What's happened to you? I told him. All of it, flat and clinical, the way I'd have briefed a grand jury. The forged reverse mortgage, the drained account, the sedatives in the tea, the fraudulent power of attorney, the bought and paid for capacity evaluation, the guardianship petition with a hearing date 6 weeks out. I didn't editorialize. I just laid down the facts, one after another, like cards. When I finished, Frank was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone very cold and very calm, and I remembered why juries used to be afraid of him. Ray, listen to me carefully. This is textbook elder financial exploitation, and they've walked into 3 or 4 federal crimes doing it. Bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, forgery of a notarized instrument. The T makes it drugging and possibly attempted assault. But right now they think they're winning, and that is the most useful thing we have. We do not tip them off. We let them keep walking into it. Between now and that hearing, you keep playing the confused old man. You take nothing they hand you, and we build a wall of evidence so high a jury could climb it. Can you do that? Can you smile at the people who poisoned you? I looked out at the dark water where I'd taught my grandson to fish. Frank, I said, I put men behind bars who smiled at me every day of a 2-year investigation. I can smile. So that's what I did, and God help me. It was the hardest role I've ever played. For the next 6 weeks, I let Sabrina fuss over me. I let her bring the little amber bottles, and I palmed the pills and flushed them and mailed a couple more to my friend in Pittsburgh to build the record. I let Trevor put an arm around my shoulders and tell me it was all going to be fine, that they were only looking out for me, while a private forensic accountant Frank hired quietly traced where my $190,000 had gone. I let them believe I was fading. And here's the part that hollowed me out, the part I've never said out loud until right now. There were nights I'd hear Trevor's truck pull up, and my heart would still lift. Just for a second, the way it did when he was 9 years old, coming home from Little League. I'd catch myself hoping that somewhere in the middle of all this scheming, there'd be a moment where he'd look at me and remember he was my son, that the boy I'd taught to shave and to change a tire and to shake a man's hand and mean it was still in there somewhere. He never did, and every time, I'd have to fold that hope back up and put it away and remind myself what the lab report said. That's a particular kind of grief, mourning a child who's still alive and sitting right across your kitchen table. It's worse than a funeral, in some ways. At a funeral, at least the person didn't choose to leave. What Frank's people found made it plainer. Trevor's construction business had been underwater for 2 years. He'd overextended on a development that collapsed, borrowed against everything, and was drowning in nearly $400,000 of debt, with creditors closing in. My house, my land, my retirement, it wasn't enough to sink them, but it was a life raft, and they decided their father was worth more to them, declared incompetent, than loved. Sabrina, it turned out, had done this once before in another state, to an aunt who died in a memory care facility with her accounts strangely empty. Frank found the aunt's file. He found the notary, too, a man Trevor had once done a cash job building a deck for. He found Dr. Halloran, whose name showed up on 11 other capacity evaluations for families in the middle of guardianship fights, always for the side that stood to gain. 2 weeks before the hearing, on Frank's advice, I let a discreet team come out to the house one night and quietly place a small camera in the corner of the living room molding, no bigger than a shirt button. I told Sabrina the following weekend, all innocence, that I'd been thinking about the reverse mortgage, and I just couldn't recall signing anything. Could she help me understand? And that woman sat on my sofa, in the house my wife decorated, and explained to me with the patience of a saint how forgetful I'd become, how lucky I was to have children who'd handle the paperwork, how I really shouldn't worry my tired old mind about details. Then she turned to Trevor, not knowing a lens was watching, and said, "He's completely gone. The doctor's report is airtight. Once the judge signs, we sell the land, clear the Hendricks loan, and put him somewhere quiet. He won't even understand what happened." We had it all on video. Her voice, her face, every word. I'm not going to pretend that watching it back didn't take something out of me. It did. But it also burned the last of the hope away and left me clean and ready. The morning of the hearing, I dressed the part one final time. The funeral jacket, the fogged glasses, the cane. I shuffled into that county courtroom, looking like a man the world had already finished with, and I took my seat, and I let them believe they'd won right up until the last possible second. Pruitt, their attorney, went first, and he was good. I'll give him that. He painted a portrait of a beloved father in tragic decline. The grief over his wife, the truck left running, the missed appointments, the confusion, the middle-of-the-night calls. He entered Dr. Halloran's evaluation into evidence. He spoke of how much this loving family didn't want to be here, how they'd resisted this painful step as long as they possibly could, how their only wish was to keep their dear father safe and comfortable in his final years. Trevor dabbed at his eyes. Sabrina held his hand. It was a masterful performance, and I sat there small and shaking and let it wash over me. And then Judge Whitfield, who'd been reading the file, lifted his head to look at the respondent for the first time. And he stopped. "It can't be," he whispered. Pruitt turned, thrown off his rhythm for the first time all morning. "Your Honor, is everything all right? Should we call a recess?" The judge didn't seem to hear him. He leaned forward over the bench, his eyes fixed on my face, and something was moving behind them. Shock, and then a dawning, almost reverent disbelief. "Raymond Ellison," he said, and it wasn't a question anymore. "My God, Ray Ellison." I straightened up in my chair. Slowly, I set the cane aside. I took off the fogged glasses and folded them into my pocket, and when I spoke, my voice came out the way it used to come out across a federal courtroom, low and steady, and carrying to every corner of the room without any effort at all. "Hello, Daniel," I said. "It's been a long time." Sabrina's head snapped toward me. I heard the sharp little intake of her breath. Trevor went rigid, the false tears drying on his face, staring at me like he'd never seen me before, and in a way, he never had. Pruitt looked back and forth between the judge and me like a man watching a car accident in slow motion. Judge Whitfield turned to the counsel table, and his voice cracked like a whip. "Mr. Pruitt, do you have any idea who is sitting at that table?" Pruitt swallowed. "Your Honor, the respondent is Raymond Ellison, the subject of the petition, whose incapacity is well documented in the 26 years ago," the judge said, cutting him off, and now he was speaking to the whole room. "I was a first-year assistant U.S. attorney who'd been handed a fraud case so complicated I didn't sleep for a month. I was drowning. My career was going to end before it started, and a special agent from IRS Criminal Investigation walked into my office with a box of ledgers and spent 6 weeks teaching me how to read them. That man built the case that made my name. He was, without exception, the finest financial investigator I ever worked beside in 30 years on the bench and off it. There wasn't a forged document in this country that man couldn't take apart." He looked back at me, and I watched the last of the disbelief settle into certainty. "And you're telling me he can't manage his own checkbook?" The courtroom had gone so silent I could hear the radiator ticking against the wall. That's when Frank Delgado rose from the gallery, buttoning his jacket, and asked to be recognized as co-counsel for the respondent. The judge waved him forward like a drowning man reaching for a rope. What happened over the next hour, I won't drag you through blow by blow, but I'll tell you it was a thing of beauty. Frank moved to introduce the lab reports first. 3 independent analyses showing that the supplements my daughter-in-law had been feeding me were prescription sedatives, unprescribed, administered without my knowledge. Then, the parking receipt and the cardiology records, placing me 300 miles away, on the day I supposedly signed a power of attorney in front of a Willow Creek notary. Then the forensic accountant's report, tracing every dollar of the reverse mortgage straight into the account that had wired $400,000 to a construction creditor named Hendricks. Then Dr. Halloran's other 11 evaluations, all conveniently favorable to whoever was paying. Then a sworn affidavit from the notary, who, faced with a forgery charge, had decided very quickly that he'd rather talk than take the fall alone. And then Frank asked the court's permission to play a short video. Pruitt objected so fast he nearly fell over. The judge overruled him, and the courtroom watched my daughter-in-law, in high definition, explain that I was completely gone, that the plan was to sell the land, clear the debt, and put me somewhere quiet. When the screen went dark, nobody moved. Trevor was staring at the table with his jaw slack. Sabrina had gone the color of ash. Judge Whitfield removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, and when he looked up, the warmth I'd heard when he recognized me was gone, replaced by something cold and final. "The petition for guardianship," he said, "is denied, in its entirety." He turned to a woman I hadn't noticed sitting quietly in the back, an investigator from Adult Protective Services who, it turned out, Frank had briefed weeks earlier. "I'm referring this matter to the district attorney and to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Reyes, I'd ask that your office open a formal file today." Then he looked at my son and my daughter-in-law, and his voice dropped low. "You didn't just try to steal from this man. You tried to erase him. I've spent my whole life around the law, and I have rarely seen anything so cold." They arrested Sabrina in the parking lot. Trevor a few days later, when the federal charges came down. I'd love to tell you I felt nothing but triumph walking out of that courtroom into the pale winter sun. But the truth is more complicated, and if I've learned anything worth passing on, it's that the truth usually is. I stood on the courthouse steps, and I watched them lead my boy to a car, hands behind his back, and I thought about a thunderstorm 40 years ago, and a flooded road, and a young man praying his son into the world. And I grieved, not for what he'd done. I was clear-eyed about that, but for the man he could have been, and chose not to be. You can hold justice in one hand and heartbreak in the other. Nobody warns you about that. The rest came quickly, the way these things do once the dam breaks. Sabrina, it came out, had done nearly the identical thing to her aunt years before. That old case was reopened, and the two matters together were more than enough. She pleaded out to elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and drugging a vulnerable adult, and she's serving a long sentence now in a state facility, stripped of the SUV, and the leather seats, and the good posture. Trevor was convicted on bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and forgery, and he'll be a guest of the federal government for the better part of a decade. Dr. Halloran lost his license and is facing his own charges. The notary took a deal. The reverse mortgage was unwound, my house made whole, every dollar clawed back through the courts. The law, it turns out, moves with real speed when a furious judge and an old investigator's paper trail are pushing at its back. But here's the part I most want you to carry with you, because it's the part that matters. Through all of it, there was one person in my family who never wavered. My grandson, Caleb. Trevor's boy, 20 years old, in his second year at Penn State studying to be an engineer. When his own father was working to have me committed, Caleb was driving up on weekends to split firewood and sit on the porch with me and talk about nothing at all. He never believed for 1 minute that I was losing my mind, and he told me so. And near the end, when things got dangerous, it was Caleb who quietly told me his mother had been crushing something into a coffee grinder late at night. I'd already known, but that a boy could love his grandfather more than he feared his own parents' anger. That told me the ledger of my life still balanced. Whatever else had gone wrong on it. I took the money I recovered, and I set most of it aside. Some went into a trust for Caleb, so he'll finish school without a dime of debt. But the larger part went to establish a small fund run through Frank's firm that pays for legal defense for old folks caught in exactly the trap I nearly died in. Seniors whose own families are trying to have them declared incompetent so they can pick the bones clean. There are more of them out there than you'd ever believe. I get letters now. I answer everyone. It's a crisp morning here on the porch as I finish telling you this. The pond's got a skin of ice on it, and Caleb's coming up this weekend to help me finally fix that leaning barn 40 years too late. I've got a mug of black coffee in my hand, and for the first time in a long while I made it myself, and I'm actually drinking it. If there's one thing I'd ask you to remember, it's this. Be kind and be gentle and forgive where you can. I still believe in all of that, I do. But don't ever mistake a soft-spoken man for a weak one. And don't ever hand the keys to your whole life to anyone just because you share their blood. Love your children with everything you've got, but keep your own name on your own front door. Keep one true friend who'll pick up a midnight phone call, and never once believe that being old means you have to be a fool. The winter light is coming up gold over the hills now, right where Nora used to stand her flower boxes, and somewhere down the road I can hear a truck that might be my grandson's. I think I'll go put on a second pot of coffee.